A guard spotted a shadow outside Prince George's bedroom, the search that lasted until dawn crescent crown. The palace was quiet that night, the kind of quiet that seemed to press in from every corner, making even the softest sound feel louder than it should. Outside, the moon hung low in the sky, spilling silver light across the sprawling grounds and brushing the tall stone walls with a gentle glow. Inside, the hallways were empty, the usual bustle of servants and staff replaced by a calm that almost felt unnatural. Only the faint ticking of a distant clock marked the passing of time. Among the guards who patrolled the corridors, one young man named Thomas moved with careful steps, his polished boots echoing softly against the marble floor. He had been assigned the night watch for the West Wing, the section of the palace that housed Prince George's rooms. It was a responsibility he had carried many times before, but tonight something felt different. There was a subtle tension in the air, a sensation that made his skin prickle even as he kept up the appearance of calm. Thomas had walked this corridor countless times. He knew the location of every tapestry, the pattern of every shadow cast by the candle sconces, the soft hum of the heating system behind the walls. Yet, as he passed the door of Prince George's bedroom, he noticed something that made him stop in his tracks. There, just beyond the edge of the moonlight streaming through the window, a shadow flickered. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make Thomas's heart skip a beat. His first thought was that it might be another guard or a servant moving quietly in the hall. But the timing was off. No one was supposed to be there. He strained his eyes, trying to focus, but the figure had already shifted, merging with the darkness near the corner of the corridor. Thomas's breath caught. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing on him. Prince George was asleep inside, and the thought of any danger reaching the young prince was unbearable. He lifted his hand slowly, gripping the radio at his belt, but hesitated. If he called for backup too soon, it might disturb the palace and alert the wrong person. Or worse, it might cause unnecessary panic if it was nothing at all. He took a careful step closer, his boots making the faintest sound on the polished floor. The shadow shifted again, just a little, as if it were aware of his presence. Thomas's mind raced. Could it be a stray animal that had somehow found its way into the palace, or was it something more deliberate? He had heard stories of attempted intrusions in other royal residences, incidents that had made headlines and been retold in hushed tones among guards. The thought of being the one responsible for protecting the prince tonight made his hands tighten into fists. Thomas took another step, moving as quietly as he could. The shadow seemed to recede, staying always just out of reach, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. He wanted to turn back to wait for the senior officer on duty, but something in his gut told him to stay. He could not ignore it, not when a child's safety might depend on his vigilance. He lifted the radio once more, speaking softly into the device. "Officer Langley, this is Thomas. I think there's something outside Prince George's bedroom. I can't tell what it is." Requesting guidance. There was a brief pause, the kind that made Thomas's chest tighten. Then a calm voice responded. "Understood, Thomas. Keep your position. Do not approach alone. Backup is on its way." Thomas nodded to himself, even though no one could see him. He moved slightly to one side, keeping his eyes on the spot where he had seen the shadow. Every muscle in his body was tense. His ears picked up the smallest sounds, the distant creak of the palace doors, the soft flutter of curtains, the whisper of air through the hall. The shadow remained, elusive and silent, a presence more felt than seen. Time seemed to stretch. Minutes felt like hours. Thomas's mind raced through scenarios, some realistic, some fueled by fear. He thought about what he would do if someone tried to enter the prince's room, about the ways he could alert others without endangering the child. His training kicked in, guiding his movements, sharpening his senses. Still, the shadow moved in ways that defied explanation, appearing and disappearing as if it were playing with him. Finally, a faint sound came from the end of the hallway, a soft scuff, almost like someone dragging a foot lightly across the floor. Thomas stiffened. He could see a darker shape moving just beyond the moonlight. His heart pounded. He could feel the weight of every second, the need to act quickly without making a mistake. Just then, Officer Langley arrived, moving swiftly but quietly. Two more guards followed, and together they formed a line, advancing slowly toward the spot where Thomas had seen the shadow. The tension in the corridor was thick, every step measured, every sound amplified by the silence around them. As they reached the corner, the shadow shifted once more. It moved faster this time, darting behind a decorative screen near the prince's bedroom. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. It was close, closer than he had imagined. He motioned to the other guards, signaling them to proceed cautiously. They moved in unison, their training evident in their careful, coordinated steps. The shadows seemed to vanish into the walls themselves, slipping into darkness where the guards could not follow. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. He knew instinctively that this was no ordinary animal, no trick of the light. Something had been here, something that had noticed him, that had observed the patrol, and that had vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Officer Langley spoke in a low, steady voice. "Stay alert. We'll conduct a full sweep of the wing. Do not let your guard down for a second." Thomas nodded, though his hands were trembling slightly. They began moving down the hall, checking every corner, every door, every shadow. The palace, which had seemed peaceful, now felt like a labyrinth filled with uncertainty. The shadows cast by the moonlight seemed deeper, darker, as if hiding secrets that were just out of reach. Hours passed. The guards checked room after room, staircase after staircase, every sound amplified in the stillness of the night. Yet the shadow remained elusive, leaving behind only a feeling of being watched. Thomas could feel his senses stretched to the limit, his mind constantly scanning for movement, for anything that might indicate the presence of an intruder. Despite the fear, there was also a strange exhilaration. Thomas realized that he was living a moment that would become part of palace lore, a story told quietly among the staff for years to come. He could see himself in the retelling, alert, courageous, responsible for protecting the youngest member of the royal family during a night that no one else even knew had been so tense. Finally, as the first hint of dawn began to brush the edges of the sky with pale light, the guards regrouped. They had found no intruder, no one who could explain the shadow that had haunted the hallway. Yet the memory of it lingered, a reminder of how quickly calm could turn to uncertainty and how vigilance was the guards' truest duty. Thomas stood near Prince George's door, watching the sunlight slowly fill the room. The prince was still asleep, unaware of the night's events, and Thomas felt a mixture of relief and pride. He knew that, for now, the palace was safe. But he also knew that he would never forget the shadow, the fleeting, mysterious presence that had tested his courage, his training, and his resolve. As the hallways returned to their normal quiet, Thomas allowed himself a deep breath. The night had been long, full of tension, fear, and uncertainty, but he had faced it without faltering. And though the shadow had vanished into nothing, it had left behind something else, a sense of accomplishment, a bond with his fellow guards, and a story that would be remembered long after the sun had risen. The first rays of dawn had begun to seep into the palace corridors, painting the walls with soft gold and pink. The earlier tension of the night still clung to the air, like a shadow refusing to leave. Thomas, the young guard who had first noticed the mysterious shadow outside Prince George's bedroom, walked alongside Officer Langley and two other guards. They moved carefully, their eyes scanning every corner, every doorway. Despite the faint morning light, their vigilance had not wavered. The shadow had vanished, or so it seemed, but Thomas knew better than to assume the palace was safe yet. Officer Langley led the small team through the west wing, the part of the palace that housed the prince's chambers. Each door they passed was checked, the guards moving with precise coordination. Thomas noticed the careful rhythm of their movements. The way Langley's voice was always calm, instructive, guiding them to cover every angle. Even as Thomas tried to calm his own nerves, the memory of the shadow's fleeting movement haunted him. They reached the grand staircase, a sweeping curve of polished marble that led to the upper floors. Thomas paused for a moment, glancing over the railing at the empty hall below. His gaze caught a flicker of movement, a fleeting, indistinct shape that vanished before he could identify it. He blinked, questioning whether he had imagined it, but the uneasy feeling remained. Something was not right. Langley noticed Thomas's hesitation and gave him a quiet nod. "Stay sharp. Keep your focus." His voice was steady, but Thomas sensed the tension in the senior officer's posture. They moved down the hallway that connected the prince's wing to the main areas of the palace. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of the curtains in the gentle morning breeze seemed louder than it should have been. Thomas's senses were heightened, every small sound and movement amplified in his mind. The guards split into pairs to cover more ground. Thomas and another guard, Daniel, went toward the east corridor, checking side rooms and storage areas that were usually empty at this hour. The light streaming through the tall windows created long, thin shadows across the polished floors, and Thomas could not shake the feeling that one of them might conceal something, or someone. As they passed the library, Thomas's sharp eyes caught a slight movement near the corner by a tall bookshelf. He froze, signaling Daniel to stop. The shadow seemed darker than the rest of the room, almost like it absorbed the light around it. He raised his hand slowly, pointing toward the spot. Daniel nodded silently and they crept closer, boots making barely a sound. When they reached the corner, there was nothing. Just the same row of books, neatly arranged as always. Thomas felt a twinge of frustration mixed with relief. The shadow had moved again, teasing them. But what was it? He had never experienced anything like this in his short years as a palace guard. The idea that someone could move so quietly and remain unseen made his heart race. Daniel broke the silence. "Do you think it was someone from outside the palace?" he whispered. "Or could it be a stray animal?" Thomas shook his head. "No, too deliberate, too precise. This wasn't random. Someone or something was watching us." They continued down the hallway, checking every door. As they moved, Thomas could feel a growing sense of unease. The palace had always felt secure, even at night, but the events of the past hours had changed everything. The shadow's presence, however fleeting, had reminded him that vigilance was never optional. One moment of carelessness could have disastrous consequences. Meanwhile, Officer Langley and the other two guards were performing similar checks on the West Wing, ensuring no one had slipped through unnoticed. Every so often, they would meet at intersections to exchange information and compare notes. Each encounter added to the tension, as the team realized just how elusive the shadow had been. It had appeared, disappeared, and left no trace behind. By mid-morning, the team had covered most of the floors, yet the shadow remained a mystery. Thomas felt a mix of frustration and admiration for whatever, or whoever, it had been. Its ability to move undetected showed cleverness, caution, and perhaps a touch of mischief. But there was also a sense of danger. No matter how small the risk, they could not ignore it. The safety of Prince George was at stake, and the young guard felt the weight of that responsibility more than ever. As they approached the palace gardens, Thomas noticed a glimmer of movement near the outer windows. He signaled the others and they moved cautiously toward the source. The light outside created long, shifting shadows, and for a moment, Thomas thought he saw the figure again. But as they reached the spot, there was nothing, only the soft rustle of leaves in the morning breeze. Officer Langley stopped and looked at Thomas. "It's clever," he said quietly. "Whoever or whatever it is, it knows the palace, it knows the routines, and it knows how to avoid detection." Thomas swallowed hard, a chill running down his spine. The realization that the shadow had been observing them, perhaps even studying their movements, made him more determined than ever. He could not let his guard down, not for a single moment. They decided to split up again. Thomas and Daniel would check the servant quarters, while Langley and the other two guards would inspect the main hallways and staircases. Every step they took was deliberate, calculated. The palace, which had seemed so peaceful, now felt like a complex maze filled with hidden threats. In the servant quarters, Thomas found signs that someone had been there. A slightly ajar door, a faint footprint on the polished floor. He signaled Daniel and they examined the area carefully. But there was no one. No intruder, no animal, just the echoes of movement that had vanished before they could identify it. The young guard felt his anxiety building, but he focused on his duty. He reminded himself that fear could not interfere with his responsibility. Prince George depended on them, and that thought gave him strength. Every hallway, every room, every shadow was treated as potentially important. Nothing was too small to overlook. Hours passed as the search continued. The palace, bathed now in full daylight, seemed to be returning to normal. But Thomas and the other guards knew better. The shadow had disappeared for now, but it had left a mark. A reminder that even in the grandest, most secure places, vigilance was never optional. By late morning, the search had extended to the outer areas of the palace. Guards moved carefully through the gardens, checking every path and hidden corner. Thomas kept a sharp eye on the bushes, the statues, and the walkways. Even the smallest sound, a falling leaf, a distant bird, made him alert. The memory of the shadow outside the prince's room kept him on edge, reminding him that danger could be clever, elusive, and silent. Finally, the team regrouped near the main hall. There had been no sign of the shadow, no clue as to who or what it had been. Thomas felt a mix of relief and lingering unease. They had searched everywhere they could think of, but the mystery remained. The palace was safe for now, but the experience had changed something inside him. The night's events had shown him how quickly calm could turn into tension, how a single shadow could create hours of uncertainty, and how important it was to remain alert at all times. Officer Langley addressed the group. "Good work, everyone. Stay alert for the rest of the day and keep an eye out for anything unusual. We may not know what caused the shadow, but we cannot underestimate it." Thomas nodded, feeling the weight of those words. The morning sun now filled the corridors, but he knew that shadows were not always what they seemed. They could hide secrets, test courage, and remind even the most experienced guards of the importance of their duty. As Thomas returned to his post outside Prince George's bedroom, he took a deep breath. The shadow had not been caught, but the palace was still standing, still protected. And though the mystery lingered, he knew that vigilance, courage, and determination would always be their best defense. The memory of the shadow stayed with him, a quiet reminder that even the most ordinary night could hold extraordinary events, and that the young prince's safety was a responsibility he could never take lightly. The palace, bathed now in the soft light of early morning, seemed peaceful to anyone who had not been on duty that night. But for Thomas and the other guards, the quiet was deceptive. The shadow they had been chasing, or perhaps had been chasing them, still lingered in their thoughts. Every hallway, every door, every flicker of light seemed to carry the possibility of movement. The young guard felt a mixture of exhaustion and alertness, his senses sharpened by hours of vigilance. Officer Langley had called for a meeting with all the guards stationed in the prince's wing. They gathered near the central corridor, forming a small circle. The officers' faces were serious, showing that despite the seemingly uneventful morning, the incident was being taken very seriously. "Listen carefully," Langley said, his voice low but firm. "We have no idea who or what caused the shadow last night. It could be a trick of the light, a reflection, or it could be someone testing the palace. We cannot afford to guess. We search methodically, and we report everything unusual, no matter how small it seems." Thomas nodded, feeling a renewed sense of duty. The thought that the shadow might have been deliberate made his skin prickle. He remembered the way it had moved, careful, deliberate, almost playful in its elusiveness. Whoever or whatever it was, they had knowledge of the palace's layout and timing. Langley divided the guards into teams. Thomas and Daniel were assigned to the north and east corridors, while other teams would cover the main halls, the staircases, and even the storage rooms and service passages. Langley reminded them to communicate clearly with radios and to move quietly. Even though daylight had arrived, the palace could still be unpredictable, and the memory of last night's shadow had taught them never to underestimate it. As Thomas and Daniel moved down the north corridor, Thomas kept his eyes sharp, scanning every corner. The marble floors reflected the morning light, making the shadows deeper and harder to read. Every painting, every ornate decoration could conceal something, or at least seem to. His imagination, fueled by the events of the night, added to the sense of tension. They checked each room methodically. Some were guest chambers, empty and silent. Others were offices lined with books and documents. Occasionally, Thomas would notice something unusual, a slightly ajar drawer, a book slightly out of place. But each time it turned out to be an ordinary detail left by a servant or staff member. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered. Halfway through the corridor, Thomas paused. There in the corner of his vision, a movement caught his eye. A shadow flickered near a window, darker than the others. He froze, his hand instinctively resting on the hilt of his sword. Daniel noticed his hesitation. "What is it?" Daniel whispered, his eyes following Thomas's gaze. I thought I saw something," Thomas said. "Move slowly." They approached cautiously, step by step. The shadow shifted slightly, as if responding to their movement. It darted toward the next corner and disappeared. Thomas's heart raced. He had seen it again, just like the night before, but only for a second. Then it was gone. Daniel shook his head. "It's incredible how fast it moves. How is it possible?" Thomas didn't answer. He didn't need to. He felt the same mixture of fear and determination he had felt hours before. The palace, despite its grandeur and security, could still hide secrets, and this shadow had proven it. They continued their search, moving into a hallway that led toward the service areas of the palace. These were usually quiet, even at this hour. Staff members would be preparing for the day, but the corridors were empty. The sound of their boots echoed against the walls, sharp and clear. Thomas felt his ears strain for any additional noises, the slightest scuff, the faintest rustle, that could indicate the shadow's presence. As they rounded a corner near the palace kitchens, Thomas thought he heard a soft sound. It was barely audible, like a whisper of movement, but it made him freeze in place. Daniel stopped as well, eyes wide. "What was that?" Daniel asked, barely moving his lips. "I'm not sure," Thomas whispered. "Stay close." They followed the sound carefully, moving toward a service door that led to the outer garden paths. The sound grew slightly, a shuffle, a movement among the leaves outside. Thomas motioned for Daniel to stay behind him. He pressed his ear toward the door, straining to hear anything. The shadow, or whatever had caused it, seemed to be just outside. Thomas opened the door slowly, stepping into the garden. The sunlight warmed his face, but he did not relax. The gardens were empty. A soft breeze rustled the leaves, and the shadows of the trees moved with it. Thomas's gaze swept the area methodically, checking every corner, every bush, every statue. Then near a tall hedge, he saw it again, a flicker darker than the surrounding shadows. He froze. The shadow had returned. It moved with a purpose, disappearing behind the hedge before he could approach. Daniel came up beside him, whispering, "It's real, it's really here." Thomas nodded. "Yes, and it's clever, it knows how to avoid us." They began a careful search of the garden, moving slowly along the paths, checking every hidden corner. The shadow seemed to be leading them in circles, appearing in one spot and disappearing in the next. Hours of careful searching revealed nothing conclusive. No footprints, no objects left behind, nothing that could identify the presence of anyone or anything. Thomas felt a mix of frustration and admiration. The shadow was clever, elusive, and precise. But there was also fear, because the possibility of someone with bad intentions could not be ruled out. The palace might be grand and secure, but it could still be infiltrated by someone patient, observant, and determined. As they walked through the garden paths, Thomas noticed the first signs of activity in the palace. Staff members moved along the corridors, preparing for the day's work, unaware of the tension that had unfolded during the night. Their calm and normalcy contrasted sharply with the heightened alertness of the guards. Thomas envied their sense of peace, but knew that his duty required constant vigilance. By late morning, Thomas and Daniel regrouped with Langley and the other guards. Everyone had searched their assigned areas thoroughly, yet the shadow had eluded them again. Officer Langley's expression was thoughtful, his brow furrowed. "We've searched everywhere we can think of," Langley said, "but we still have no answers. Something or someone was out there and we couldn't catch it. We need to stay alert and report anything unusual for the rest of the day." Thomas felt a deep sense of responsibility. The events of the night and morning had shown him that duty was not just about following orders. It was about constant awareness, about anticipating the unexpected, and about courage in the face of uncertainty. The shadow might have vanished again, but it had left an impression on every guard involved. They knew that the palace could not be taken for granted. Every corridor, every hallway, every corner could hide a secret, and the safety of Prince George depended on their attention, their training, and their determination. As they returned to their posts, Thomas glanced once more toward the prince's bedroom. Prince George was unaware of the events that had unfolded, sleeping peacefully in his room. Thomas felt a mix of relief and resolve. The shadow had not caused any harm, but it had reminded him of the importance of his role. Protecting the prince was not a duty to be taken lightly. It required patience, courage, and unwavering focus. Though the sun now filled the palace with light, the memory of the shadow lingered. Thomas knew that vigilance could not end, even in daylight. Every movement, every flicker of shadow could be significant, and though the mystery remained unsolved, he felt a quiet sense of pride. He had faced fear, uncertainty, and the unknown, and he had not faltered. The shadow, elusive and mysterious, had tested their skills, their courage, and their determination. And as Thomas resumed his patrols, he knew that this experience would remain with him long after the day was over. A story to be remembered, a lesson in vigilance, and a reminder that even in the safest places, the unexpected could appear at any moment. The sun had climbed high. In the sky, casting long, warm beams through the palace windows and into the gardens. Despite the bright morning, the tension among the guards had not lessened. Thomas and his fellow officers had searched every hallway, staircase, and garden path at least twice. Every shadow, every sound, every flicker of movement was scrutinized carefully. But the mysterious figure they had seen, what they had come to call the shadow, remained elusive. Thomas walked along the corridor leading from the prince's wing toward the inner courtyard, his eyes alert and sharp. He felt a strange mix of fatigue and determination. Hours of searching had tested his patience, but he could not allow himself to grow careless. Every step echoed in the hall, and the polished floors reflected the sunlight, creating shifting patterns that reminded him of the elusive figure. Daniel, his partner, walked beside him, scanning the area with equal attention. Neither of them spoke, knowing that even the smallest sound could distract them from noticing something important. The palace had returned to a semblance of normalcy in the staff's movements, but for the guards, every routine task was now performed with heightened awareness. Suddenly, a subtle movement caught Thomas's eye. Near one of the courtyard windows, a flicker of darkness appeared, almost like a shadow moving across the marble floor. He froze. "Did you see that?" he whispered to Daniel. Daniel followed his gaze, his eyes narrowing. "I think I did. It's gone now." Thomas's stomach tightened. The shadow had returned. Not fully, not clearly, but enough to remind him that whatever, or whoever, they were looking for, it was still here. He motioned for Daniel to follow him as he moved toward the source. Every step was careful, calculated. The shadow had become almost like a game of patience, testing their vigilance and alertness. As they approached the courtyard, Thomas noticed a pattern. The shadow seemed to appear near reflective surfaces, the polished marble floors, the glass of the windows, the metal of a decorative railing. His mind raced. Could it be a person? Could it be a trick of the light? Or was it something else entirely? He signaled to Daniel to spread out slightly, covering more ground while remaining within sight of each other. They moved slowly, eyes scanning every detail. The shadow appeared again, this time near a large statue that stood at the center of the courtyard. It flickered for a moment and then vanished behind the figure. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. He motioned for Daniel to stay back and approach the statue carefully. As he reached the spot, he noticed something he had not seen before. A set of mirrors placed strategically around the courtyard, angled in such a way that the sunlight reflected across the marble floors. The flickering shadows they had been chasing were the result of these reflections, moving in ways that deceived the eye. Daniel came up beside him, eyes widening as he understood what Thomas was seeing. "So it wasn't a person?" he asked quietly. Thomas shook his head, a mix of relief and amazement on his face. "No, it's clever and very convincing. The way the mirrors are angled, the sunlight, the shadows, they make it look like someone is moving, but it's just the light shifting." The tension that had gripped Thomas since the night before began to melt, replaced by relief and even a little laughter. The shadow, as elusive as it had seemed, was not a threat after all. It had been an illusion, created by the clever placement of reflective surfaces and the changing angle of the sunlight. Officer Langley and the other guards arrived at the courtyard shortly after, having followed the radio signals from Thomas. Their expressions changed from concern to surprise as they saw the mirrors and realized what had caused the mysterious shadow. Langley shook his head, smiling faintly. "Well, it appears we've been outsmarted by reflections," he said. "No harm done, but it certainly gave us quite a chase." Thomas felt a wave of relief wash over him. The palace was safe. Prince George was untouched and unaware of the excitement that had unfolded in the hallways and gardens. Yet the experience had left its mark. It had tested their patience, their vigilance, and their teamwork. It had reminded them that even ordinary objects, mirrors and sunlight, could create extraordinary illusions. As they examined the mirrors more closely, Thomas noticed small adjustments that allowed the reflections to shift and create movement in unexpected ways. Whoever had set them up, perhaps a previous staff member or even a decorative choice by the palace designers, had unknowingly created a scene that would trick even the most alert guard. The guards spent the next hour carefully inspecting the courtyard and the surrounding areas, ensuring that nothing else could cause confusion or pose a threat. Every corner was checked, every reflective surface examined. Thomas felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that they had uncovered the truth, but he also felt a new respect for the power of perception. Daniel nudged him lightly. "You know," he said with a grin, "we spent hours chasing a shadow that wasn't even real." Thomas chuckled, shaking his head. Yes, but it taught us something important. Even when nothing seems wrong, we must always stay alert. And sometimes the smallest details, like a mirror, can create the biggest illusions. The sun continued to rise, casting bright light across the palace gardens and hallways. The guards began to relax slightly, their earlier tension giving way to normal routines. Staff members moved through the corridors, unaware of the mystery that had gripped the palace just hours before. Thomas walked toward Prince George's room, glancing at the door with a mixture of relief and pride. Inside, the young prince slept peacefully, oblivious to the hours of careful vigilance that had taken place outside his door. Thomas smiled quietly to himself. The shadow, though harmless, had reminded him of the importance of his role, of the responsibility he carried, and of the courage required to remain alert in the face of uncertainty. Officer Langley gathered the guards once more. Good work, everyone. The palace is safe and the shadow has been explained. But remember this lesson, vigilance is never wasted. Even harmless illusions can test our skills and every detail matters. Thomas felt a quiet pride in his chest. The night and morning had been challenging, full of tension and uncertainty. But they had faced it together, relied on their training, and discovered the truth. The shadow, which had seemed so mysterious and threatening, had turned out to be nothing more than an illusion. But the experience had strengthened their skills and their resolve. As the palace returned to its normal rhythm, Thomas and Daniel resumed their patrols, walking the corridors with renewed attention. The memory of the shadow lingered, not as a threat, but as a reminder of the unexpected challenges that could appear in even the most secure places. It was a lesson in observation, patience, and courage, a story they would remember and share quietly among the guards for years to come. Thomas paused for a moment at the top of the grand staircase, looking out over the palace courtyard. The sunlight sparkled off the marble floors and the carefully placed mirrors, creating bright reflections that danced across the surfaces. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine the shadow moving among them again, and he smiled. It was a harmless trick, but it had made them all sharper, more alert, and more capable of protecting the young prince. The palace, in its grandeur and beauty, had once again proven to be a place of both mystery and safety. The shadow, elusive and clever, had tested them, but ultimately the truth had been revealed. Thomas felt a deep sense of accomplishment, knowing that he had faced uncertainty and remained steadfast in his duty. As the day continued, the guards shared their story quietly, exchanging smiles and laughter over the harmless chase. The shadow had caused hours of tension, but it had also brought them together, strengthened their teamwork, and reminded them why vigilance was the cornerstone of their responsibility. And though Prince George would never know of the shadow that had haunted his bedroom corridors, Thomas and the other guards knew that their diligence had ensured his safety. The palace was calm once more, the mystery resolved, and the lessons of that night and morning would remain with them forever. A story of courage, observation, and the power of careful attention to detail. The palace had settled into its normal rhythm, the grandeur and quiet order. Returning after the long night and tense morning. Sunlight spilled into every corner, warming the polished marble floors and the tall walls adorned with portraits of past monarchs. Staff moved briskly through the halls, preparing for the day, unaware of the events that had unfolded during the night. But for Thomas and the other guards, the memory of the shadow still lingered. It had tested their vigilance, their patience, and their nerves, and though it had turned out to be nothing more than an illusion, the lessons it left behind were real. Thomas walked through the corridor toward Prince George's room, his steps slower now, reflective. The palace felt alive in a different way than before. Every sound, every flicker of light, and every movement of the curtains held a new significance. He passed the grand staircase, the echo of his boots sounding softer in the morning calm, yet he could still feel the tension that had filled the halls just hours earlier. Daniel caught up with him, a grin spreading across his face. "I still can't believe we spent all night and morning chasing a shadow," he said. "All it took was sunlight and mirrors." Thomas shook his head with a small smile, though his mind remained serious. "It may have been harmless, but it taught us something important. We have to be ready for anything, even if it seems impossible. That's what being a guard is about." They entered the courtyard one last time, examining the mirrors and the angles that had caused the illusion. Thomas traced his fingers along the edge of one of the polished surfaces, feeling the smooth coolness of the glass. It was clever work, either by design or by coincidence, but it had tested them all. The shadow had been an unexpected challenge, forcing the guards to remain alert and sharp for hours, and it had reminded them that in the palace, even the ordinary could become extraordinary. Officer Langley approached, his expression calm but appreciative. "Well done, both of you. You stayed focused, methodical, and alert the entire time. That's what I want from every guard. Tonight's experience may have been a trick of light, but your response was real courage." Thomas felt a warmth in his chest, a mixture of pride and relief. To receive recognition from Langley, a respected and experienced officer, was more rewarding than he could express. It wasn't just about catching the shadow. It was about diligence, teamwork, and responsibility. The shadow might have been harmless, but their vigilance had ensured that Prince George remained safe. They walked together toward the west wing, the palace slowly filling with life. Servants and staff moved about, preparing breakfast and attending to their daily duties, oblivious to the tension of the night. Thomas glanced at Prince George's door, the small curtains fluttering gently in the morning breeze. The prince slept peacefully, unaware of the chase that had unfolded outside his room. Thomas smiled softly. It was a quiet victory, and in its own way it was satisfying. Langley gathered the guards for a final briefing. This morning was a reminder that even harmless things can challenge us. Shadows, reflections, or even unusual sounds, anything can test our focus. Our responsibility is not only to respond, but to anticipate, to remain alert, and to ensure that no matter the situation, the palace and its residents remain safe. Thomas felt the weight of Langley's words. It was a duty that extended beyond training, beyond routine patrols. It was a responsibility that demanded vigilance, courage, and an understanding that even the smallest detail could hold importance. The shadow had been a lesson in observation, in patience, and in the need to remain calm under pressure. As the briefing ended, the guards dispersed to their posts, resuming their daily routines. Thomas remained for a moment, walking slowly along the corridor outside the prince's bedroom. He remembered the first time he had seen the shadow, the way his heart had raced, and his mind had worked to anticipate danger. Now, looking back, he realized how much he had grown in those hours. The experience had tested him, yes, but it had also strengthened his resolve and his confidence. Daniel joined him, carrying a small cup of tea. "You look deep in thought," he said. Thomas took the cup, smiling faintly. "I am. Last night and this morning it was a test. Not of strength or skill, but of awareness and patience. I've never felt responsibility so strongly." Daniel nodded. "I know what you mean. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a reminder of why we're here, to protect, to notice what others might overlook." They sipped their tea in companionable silence, watching as the palace staff moved efficiently through their routines. The tension of the past hours had left a lingering respect for the role they played. It was not glamorous, and few would ever know the events that had unfolded. But their vigilance had mattered. The safety of Prince George of the palace depended on it. Later that morning, the senior officers gathered the guards in the main hall. Thomas stood among them, proud and slightly weary, as Langley addressed the group. "Tonight's events have reminded us of the importance of focus, coordination, and calm under pressure. While the shadow turned out to be a harmless illusion, your response demonstrated skill and dedication. Remember, vigilance is never wasted, even when the threat seems imaginary." The officers distributed commendations, small tokens of recognition, and words of praise for the guards involved. Thomas received his with quiet satisfaction, feeling the significance of the moment. It wasn't about the acknowledgement. It was about knowing that he had acted correctly, stayed calm, and performed his duty when it mattered most. As the palace gradually returned to normal, Thomas and Daniel returned to their posts for the final rounds of the morning. They walked the corridors together, their eyes scanning the walls, the doors, the windows. The memory of the shadow, though resolved, remained in their minds. It was no longer a source of fear, but a reminder of the unexpected challenges that could appear in even the most secure places. Passing Prince George's bedroom one last time, Thomas paused. He looked at the sleeping prince, small and serene, unaware of the night and morning spent ensuring his safety. Thomas felt a profound sense of fulfillment. His role, though quiet and often unnoticed, was meaningful. The shadow had tested them, but in the end their vigilance had prevailed. Daniel nudged him lightly. "Think anyone will believe the story?" he asked with a grin. Thomas laughed softly. "Maybe not, but it doesn't matter. We know what happened, and we know our responsibility was fulfilled." The palace staff moved about, unaware of the adventure that had unfolded among the guards. Yet for Thomas, Daniel, and their colleagues, the day carried a new understanding of their duty. Shadows, illusions, and unexpected events were part of their world. The difference lay in how they responded, with patience, vigilance, and courage. By midday, the palace had fully returned to routine. Guards resumed standard patrols, staff attended to daily tasks, and the young prince remained safe, blissfully unaware of the test of vigilance that had taken place just hours before. Thomas walked along the corridor one final time, reflecting on the events. The shadow had been clever, mysterious, and even unsettling, but it had ultimately reinforced the importance of attention to detail, teamwork, and responsibility. He paused at the grand staircase, looking down at the polished marble and the bright reflections of sunlight. For a moment he imagined the shadow moving among the floors again. He smiled quietly, knowing that even though it was harmless, it had changed him. He felt stronger, more alert, and more confident in his ability to protect those in his care. Officer Langley approached, placing a reassuring hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You did well," he said simply. "Remember this moment. It's not just about the shadow. It's about vigilance, courage, and the role you play every day. Few may see it, but it matters." Thomas nodded, feeling a deep sense of pride. He realized that the events of the night and morning would remain with him forever, a story of caution, courage, and the quiet triumph of duty. The shadow had been an illusion, but the lessons it taught were real and lasting. As the day wore on, Thomas returned to his post, walking the halls with steady steps and alert eyes. The palace was calm, the corridors filled with light and normal activity. Yet he knew that vigilance was never optional. Shadows could appear anywhere, illusions could trick the mind, and the unexpected could always arrive. But he was ready. He had learned, he had grown, and he would continue to guard Prince George with unwavering dedication. The shadow had tested them, challenged them, and left its mark. And in the end, it had reminded every guard that even in the safest places, responsibility, attention, and courage were what kept the palace and the prince truly secure.